This is the podcast of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment. Welcome.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment podcast. I am Maria Miguel Oliveira da Silva, PhD researcher at Nova School of Law and Research Associate of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment. Today, I have the pleasure of having with me Maria Pia Bianchetti, Program Specialist on Child Rights and Business at UNICEF. Our guest today has a deep expertise in the field of children's rights and have been working for UNICEF for the last 4 years. I am very sure that our listeners will be fascinated by her inputs. Hello, Maria.
Hello, Maria Miguel. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you and thanks for hosting me on this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here with us today. It is a great pleasure indeed. So to start, can you tell us a bit more about your job and describe what does a program specialist at UNICEF do?
Sure. So as you said, I work as a program specialist on child rights and business at UNICEF. And I'm part of a team in UNICEF that is responsible for guiding and supporting UNICEF engagement with business around addressing negative impacts of business activities on children's rights. So we look at the impact of the business sector on child rights and how to address this to ensure that businesses prevent and mitigate such negative impacts. In particular, my role provides technical advice on how to design and integrate child rights consideration in business and human rights related legislation and legal frameworks, and in particular working on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence and corporate disclosure standards.
Perfect. So I'm going to ask you an impossible question. We are very aware of it. Do you believe that the world in general is better than like 50 years ago for children to live in terms of business and human rights, for example?
It's a difficult question indeed, but this year we celebrate 10 years of the Children's Rights and Business Principles. These are principles that were developed by UNICEF, Save the Children and UN Global Compact to help guide business in addressing their impact on children. So what we have been noticing in this past 10 years is that while in 2012, there was a general awareness of child labor as an important issue for business and for government as well to address, there was really limited recognition on the fact that businesses can have an impact on the full range of the rights of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, in the past decade, we've seen efforts to actually widen the scope of action, while recognizing that child labor is one of the crucial parts of a business respect for children's rights, but also starting to recognize that there are other areas that need to be addressed. So we're seeing 3 different, mainly complementary actions taken by relevant actors, policymakers, businesses, other stakeholders to ensure that children's rights are integrated into business practices. The first pillar, we've seen that some businesses, either individually or as an industry, are starting to take voluntary actions to understand and address their impact on children. The second type of action that we've seen is, looking at the broader business and human rights framework, we are seeing some proactive action by regulators, policymakers, and investors to create an environment that enables businesses to respect children's rights. Then there is a third approach that we're also seeing that is being under development that is about more a holistic approach to specific issues that affect children's rights. And that also include the role of businesses and how to prevent and mitigate their adverse impact. So one example is the joint agendas of business and governments on family-friendly workplace policies. And so these are developments that are significant looking back at 10 years ago for the progress of children's rights in the business and human rights agenda. But it is true that we still have a long way to go before children's rights are routinely assessed and mitigated by businesses.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. It is very important, and it is. We have been watching that improving, but it is a lot to do yet. So I think it is very important what you are saying. So just to change a little bit the topic, but well, it is of course in regard to what we have been discussing. In your opinion, what is, well, in general, but what is the biggest challenge that children will face in the near future? I mean, besides climate change and child labor, can you give us an example that the wider community is not aware of?
Sure. So obviously child labor and climate change are crucial challenges for children, but there are also other rights that are being impacted. And it is important that impacts on children are addressed holistically and are recognized. It's also, we need to acknowledge that businesses are intrinsic to the economic and social dimensions that revolve around children and that influence their lives, their experiences, and their future. So, virtually all children are essentially impacted by business in one way or another. So one example is the impacts on children's rights in the digital environment, which is a critical and growing issue. Technology is a growing part of school and social life around the world, and it also offers unique opportunities for children. However, children still remain at risk of exploitation and abuse online. So, for example, their personal data are often harvested without informal consent. Algorithms mold online experiences in hidden ways, and children can still be exposed to safety risk and online harms. And what is also important to realize is that most, if not all, companies have a digital presence of some kind. So this is not only an issue for tech companies, but also for all those companies that in some way interact with children online, because, for example, children are consumers or they are users of the digital products and services. And data collection and processing affects a wide variety of child rights and must be used in their best interest. Privacy and protection of children's information and identities are incredibly important because as they grow and they develop their personalities, children experiment by making different choices and explore different preferences. So it is critical that children are afforded the agency to define who they are for themselves without having instead their future pathways predetermined or their learning studies and their learning style unduly narrowed down by algorithms.
Absolutely. And do you think, in another topic, do you think that legal developments have the power to effectively change the issue of child exploitation? And if yes, is there any particular regulatory development that you consider to be particularly effective?
I mean, legal developments are crucial to create a legal and regulatory framework that enables businesses to respect children's rights. We must not forget that while businesses are accountable for the impact of their activities on human and children's rights and the environment, the ultimate responsibility to ensure respect for children's rights lies with the authorities at national level. So in this sense, policies, regulation, legislation can all bring change at a scale and pace in corporate behavior and can bring accountability that business voluntary actions cannot bring. But also legislation and regulation bring clarity to businesses on what the expectations are on them on human rights and children's rights. So one of the most significant developments that we are seeing is currently this trend towards creating mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence mechanisms at national, regional, and international levels. Human rights and environmental due diligence is one of the most effective ways for companies to identify and prevent negative impacts. However, we also know we have evidence that there are still too many companies that are not conducting it, and even fewer that integrate child rights considerations in their due diligence, which means that impacts on children remain overlooked and therefore unaddressed. However, mandating it through legislation can really create impact at scale and shape corporate behavior. What is necessary, however, to realize the potential of this type of legislation to be transformative and effective for children's rights is that children's rights are made visible, which means mechanisms, due diligence mechanisms, and those that are connected to those mechanisms are accessible to children. And it means also that implications for children's rights are embedded in the design of due diligence legislation and implementation. Another critical development is around the corporate sustainability reporting, which is one of the key pillars of effective sustainable corporate framework. And it's also complementary to mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. Sustainability reporting enhances corporate transparency, allows key stakeholders to evaluate and measure companies' performance on human rights, and also allows companies to demonstrate effective implementation of due diligence on human rights and the environment as well. And in this case as well, it is crucial that children's rights are adequately reflected in disclosure standards. So in this sense, the developments that are currently happening at the European level in these fields are significant because they have the potential to significantly improve responsible business conduct regional and globally. They can influence other legislators and help drive the strengthening of national systems in countries of business global value chains. But again, for all developments to be effective for children, then children's rights must be explicitly reflected.
Very interesting. And finally, this one is very difficult to, if you could choose one and only one measure to promote the elimination of child labor, which one will it be?
Child labor stems from complex, interdependent root causes, such as poverty, lack of access to education, poor social protection, which means that in order to tackle child labor, there needs to be a multi-sectoral approach focusing on children and particularly building and strengthening the capacity of public institutions. And unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. So actions to address child labor should always be context-specific, but responsible business conduct to address child labor can be guided by three pillars of actions. The first one is to integrate child labor prevention strategies into core business strategies, procurement practices, and corporate decision-making. We know that businesses rarely address child labor holistically through the different pathways that they can cause or contribute to child labor. However, integrating child labor prevention strategies means, for example, integrating child rights into social risk and impact assessments throughout the supply chain. It means reviewing the impact of purchasing practices and supplier engagement practices and ensure that these do not contribute or cause to decent work deficits. It also means integrating child rights consideration into grievance and remediation processes. The second connected pillar of action is about investing in internal and business partner capacity and community resilience in relation to key child rights deprivation and external efforts and programs. So, for example, it's looking to support community programs to address root causes of child labor, support local and national government efforts to strengthen child protection and social protection systems. And in this case, it is crucial that businesses do not create parallel systems that undermine public service efforts. And this should be instead supportive and focus on strengthening existing systems. And the third connected pillar is about inspiring others to take action internally and in collaboration with others. So businesses can really drive industry change by making public commitments to children's rights, pledging targeted action, but also calling on and inspiring others to become advocates and to collectively tackle root causes of child labor.
Thank you so very much, Maria. Is there a last anything that you would like to have before when we end our discussion?
I think if I can make a few words about the EU proposal on corporate sustainability due diligence to bring to life really what we've been talking about so far. I think one key things that we have learned in the years that we know that children are physiologically, socially, and physically developing beings. And so this one puts them in a especially vulnerable situation, which means that standards and policies that are based only on adults do not necessarily protect children adequately and appropriately. So that's what when we talk about integrating child rights considerations, making children's rights visible in mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, that's what we mean, because we know that otherwise those mechanisms that are being designed will not necessarily adequately ensure that children's rights are protected and realized. So bringing this into a concrete example for us, it means explicitly recognizing that businesses need to give special attention to the rights and needs of children, as well as other groups in situations of vulnerability and marginalizations in their due diligence, but also means for states to remove barriers for this group in accessing justice. And so any legislation on due diligence should contain these requirements. We also impacts on children happens beyond the supply chain, they happen throughout the value chain. So for example, think about marketing and advertising and how this can impact children's rights as well. And also they happen also in less formal sectors that can still feed into international brands value chain. So it is important that due diligence legislation covers the full value chain of businesses, but also means integrating a stronger child rights and human rights-based approach to due diligence. It means going beyond contractual clauses and audits, which we know that often do not lead to the effective prevention of adverse impacts on children, and they might actually lead to unintended consequences for them. So, and the fact is that businesses can do much more than contractual clauses in their due diligence. And so it means that legislation should recognize that businesses need to consider their own purchasing practices, pricing, employment practices. They should consider also how their product development and end use can negatively affect children, as well as the broader context where they are sourcing from and where they are operating. Something very specific to children is when we talk about preventative mitigating and remedial measures, and then it is necessary that the best interest of the child is a primary consideration when businesses devise these measures. So, for example, if a company, in order to prevent child labor, has a policy of excluding every under 18 years of age from employment, that might push children to look for other working opportunities that might be more risky and more exploitative. Applying a best interest of the child lens to this would mean that businesses should still look whether there are safe and legal working opportunities for young workers in their business that could be offered. All of this obviously in line with legislation, but we know that under certain circumstances, young workers can legally and safely work. And also something that is coming more prominently in the debate, and in fact, now we're talking about human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, is really joining the environmental and social aspects of due diligence, because we know that there are unintended risks for children in the green transition, but we also know that this can be avoided if effective human rights due diligence is implemented by companies. But also recognizing that climate change is a multiplying factor of risk, which means that businesses need to consider it when they identify risks to people and when they identify measures to prevent this risk from happening.
Perfect, Maria. Thank you. Thank you very much for this. It is really impressive and very interesting for our listeners, I am very sure. So thank you, everybody, for being with us. And to you, Maria Pia, for accepting our invitation. Stay tuned for the next episodes. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.